discussion. As everybody is joining the meeting, I'm going to wait until most people connect to audio. But I wanted to go ahead and give a quick shout out for all of you for signing up for this webinar discussion, and a little plug for URISA International. If you guys are not members and you find this content valuable, please consider joining. We have a NG 911 working group that talks about these types of concepts, as well as help bringing them to the larger GIS forefront. My name is Rachel Marquez / Rodriguez, as it says in my Zoom, I guess. I am the chair of URISA's Next Gen 911 task force, and I'm heavily involved in URISA. I also work for Los Angeles County as their countywide address management coordinator. If you guys can go ahead and mute yourselves if you're not talking. But I'm going to go ahead and kick this off by introducing our two main panelists today, which is Ed Wells and Christian Jacqz. I think I could say that right, maybe. Close enough. If not, he'll correct it. Ed, do you want to go ahead and give a little brief intro about yourself?
Sure. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ed Wells, past president of URISA and former GIS manager before I retired. And more to the point for this webinar, I was one of the 4 co-chairs that led the committee that drafted the FGDC address data standard. I was also technical editor for the committee that drafted the NENA CLDXF version 1 standard. I've been an active participant in the work group that has drafted the proposed revisions, that'd be CLDXF version 2. The point being that I'm pretty familiar with all these documents and why they say what they say and how they came to be what they are now. With that, I'll turn it over to Christian.
Hello, everybody. I've been working with developing GIS and location data in support of 911 for more than a decade. And most of that time I was the director of Mass GIS, which is our state's primary GIS resource. I saw Claire Brill on the list. Hi, Claire. I'm retired now. I was involved with the program up through the rollout of statewide next generation 911 system, which went very well. Hooray. And at the start, at the heart of that NG system is a complete statewide inventory of building footprints and associated location records, what we're talking about today, which is being maintained based on imagery, parcel data, and address data, and local data, and a lot of field work. So I can start sharing my screen and jump right into the presentation if that's what you want, Wendy.
Yep, I think that's what we're in for.
Okay. So here's a presentation which was pretty much based on something I did for the FGDC address theme subcommittee. Just a little background. I'll go pretty quick because probably people know most of this stuff. CLDXF is a standard maintained by the National Emergency Number Association, and it provides a minimum structure for location records used in 911 systems. And it provides a template for all the other NENA standards. So the GIS data model, for example, it's not just an exchange format, it's kind of the beginning of standardizing location records throughout NENA. And it's also, it was originally just about landline call records, but now it's relevant for calls from wireless devices, voice over IP, bundled residential phone service, MLTS systems, etc. So a lot has changed since 911 was invented. And because of the rollout of Next Gen 911, many states like ours have built or are building CLDXF compliant location databases. And the records are being linked to GIS features, so site structure address points. And these GIS databases are being used at local, regional, state levels as master address databases for many other purposes besides 911. So got to acknowledge the multi-purpose nature of these data. And Our own statewide database is publicly available. It's widely used by the private sector, used in support of delivering government services, public health, transportation, assessing, housing, environment, et cetera, all kinds of agencies. So CLDXF v1 is largely compatible with the federal address standard, the FGDC standard, in managing street addresses. And where those two differ is in the management of so-called subaddress data elements. So FGDC has a general purpose subaddress element, which can be parsed into identifier and type. And CLDXF requires the classification of each component of a subaddress. So you have fixed types like building and floor and unit and room and seat and so on. And by the way, I might call these elements. You can also think of them, though, that's XML. You can think of them as fields in a database. And I'm going to talk about mostly the changes from V1, CLDXF V1 to V2. So remember, street addresses are going to be formatted very similarly. The classification of what we now call named locations in V2, the building, floor, unit, et cetera, is a burden, no question, but it provides important benefits. So it ensures data quality and standardization and supports validation. And a lot of times building these systems, you're conflating data from different sources. And this approach, we feel it really facilitates that exercise. And it means that also that all the records that relate to a particular site or a building can be linked to GIS representations of those features. So the standard organizes data in a way that is specifically useful to dispatchers and responders and the folks that build systems for their use. But we also feel that it leads to more usable and better quality data overall. So the version 2 work group started its calls in March 2018, oh my God, with about 40 members. That included 911 system developers and integrators, GIS data managers, first responders, call center staff, et cetera. And the perspective of the latter, the first responders and the call center staff on the calls, was tremendously important. So what do responders need to know to initiate a response? How does the location record correspond to what responders see when they arrive on the site? The perspective of application developers was also important. How are data entered into the system and validated during operations? And then many of our members were GIS data managers, so their perspective on integrating GIS with the structure that we were developing, as will be done in the GIS data model, that was an important influence. So the overarching objective here is to specify locations precisely and consistently, consider the needs of responders and the 911 system, next-gen system requirements. So that's validation and call routing and dispatch. Now, in V1, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? In V1, landmarks and subaddress buildings are defined as shown here. So landmark name part is in CLDXF V1, it's defined as a prominent feature, which is publicly known. And the complete landmark name consists of one or more landmark name parts. So a complete landmark name might be State University of New York at Buffalo, North Campus, Baldy Hall. And the parts would be the State University of New York at Buffalo, the North Campus, and Baldy Hall. Those would be 3 components of the location record. And in this case, the building is a landmark part. But a building can also be a subaddress element defined as one among a group of buildings that have the same address number and the complete street name. So the latter is basically derived from the FGDC definition that a subaddress is a separate identifiable portion of a feature, the whole of which is identified by, I'm editorializing, but a street address or a landmark name. So the majority of the workgroup members found these CLDXF V1 definitions to be problematic. So they overlap in some ways, and they require a classification of buildings in particular into landmark or non-landmark features that's not really useful in a 911 context. So prominent and publicly known, these are subjective definitions. And also the landmark parts are nested, and how deep do you nest them, and when do you transition kind of to a subaddress? So from the definition, if a single address covers multiple buildings, those would be considered subaddress features. But what if one of them is also a landmark? Or conversely, you could have many sort of ordinary non-landmark buildings that have identifiers, and they also have multiple street addresses assigned to one building. So they don't really qualify as either a subaddress or a landmark feature. So in these situations, the definitions in CLDXF v1 are confusing or they don't work. So we want to be sure, given all the stakeholders in the 911 data compilation process, we want to be sure that everybody's going to use all these elements the same way. So the solution the work group came up with was to eliminate the distinction between landmark and subaddress elements and create a single hierarchy, which we called named locations. So CLDXF v1 had the building, floor, unit, room, seat elements, and we added to that. We extended it. We added elements to deal with named exterior areas and sub areas. And we also expanded the definition of a building to include all types of structures that would be bridges, tanks, cell towers, and so on, which weren't included in V1. And any building identifier goes in the structure element. So a building is a building is a building, basically. And the identifier for a structure can be a proper name, like Italian Hall, an arbitrary alphanumeric string, like A, building 5, or it can be a functional name like storage tank number 5, cafeteria building. So all of these are structure identifiers. And we also tried to accommodate the difficult cases, which are things like parking lots, sub areas within larger named areas, slips and marinas, lots and trailer parks, seating areas in stadiums and performance venues, et cetera. You see the list here. These are all things that came up during the discussion as difficult to manage. So here's the whole hierarchy of location types in CLDXF v2. You can see that it goes from larger to smaller and from outside areas to enclosed interior spaces for the first 6 elements anyway. And then we have some new elements, which I'll talk about. They deal with unenclosed interior spaces. So at the top level is site, an identified area of land which may or may not have structures. This is new. And then within a site, you can have a subsite, which is a named sub area of a site, like a parking lot. And then structure is like the old building, but it's expanded to include any kind of vertical built feature. So I said, a cell tower, a tank, a bridge, et cetera. So I'm going to illustrate how these elements are used and then come back to this list. Here's an example. A common challenge in managing location descriptions is buildings in office parks, medical, academic campuses, government complexes, military bases, things like that. So street addresses may or may not exist, or they may not be used. And in a campus situation, a lot of buildings might not be near a named thoroughfare. So street addresses might not be physically intuitive. And here's the MIT campus, which illustrates the challenge. And in CLDXF v2, the campus is a site. It's a delineated area within which you have a collection of buildings. And then here's a subsite. It's an identified sub area of the overall site. And in this case, it's the East Campus, and it's a collection of a few buildings. So the MIT campus is kind of special. I think it's the center of the world, really. But many buildings have a name and a number, and neither version of CLDXF really handles that very well. But in a database, you'd have to have some form of aliasing. But the point is here that in CLDXF v1, you're looking here at the student center. It's a very well-known building. It'd be a landmark. But in v2, it's just another building identifier. And to illustrate this landmark issue, where the student center is a prominent feature, you have a lot of buildings on the MIT campus that may not be well known to callers, even a subset of callers who are members of the MIT community. So here's the power plant annex. I don't know what the signage is. Is the building a landmark? Maybe it is. Maybe it's an outstanding example of 1920s power plant architecture, and tour buses go by there every day. But the point is that a Comcast technician really wouldn't have any basis for deciding if it's a landmark. Knows the name of it, but not it's kind of how to classify it that way. So again, a building is a building is a building. Now here's the rest of the named location hierarchy. So we have wing, unit, room, section, row, seat, and floor. And wing is new. So it's defined as a large part of a structure. We found that a lot of location descriptions need that extra level of identifier. So we have hospitals, airport terminals, mall buildings, large residential structures. Those are typical situations where you might have a wing, and it might be called the wing, it might not. Then you have units and rooms, which are part of the standard before. And then we added some elements to deal with, again, the difficult cases that came up in our discussion. So a section is an identified unenclosed area within a structure. So it's not a room. It's something like a part of a stadium or a huge factory, open factory floor. So no walls, but still a defined location. And row is also new. It's a linear collection of seats or workstations, equipment, storage, et cetera. So that would be for very large structures, again, like warehouses, factories. And then seat was always there. It's still the smallest location within a building. And again, we're trying to provide structure for a very detailed and precise description of an interior or an exterior location. So it's all about location. That's what's driving this. That's why the link to GIS is so important. So elements like site and structure link to mapping or other spatial documents, seating plans for sports venues, et cetera. The point is to manage all these linkages by connecting to the hierarchy at whatever level of mapping that you have. If you have a site polygon, if you have a building footprint, if you have a site structure at an address point, that information gets you to the parcel or the building, and then all the rest of the detail here lets you, sort of find what you're looking for. So that's I promised to be done in 10 or 15 minutes. That's a very, very rapid, condensed overview of the changes between V1 and V2. And I guess at that point, we should let Ed sort of raise the issues that he has with this evolution of the standard. The document that I sent out is essentially the notes for the PowerPoint presentation that you just saw. And I think it's, it's a good reference. But most of all, I would urge everybody to go to the NENA website. And I don't know if we distributed the link, but the CLDXF V2 is up for public comment. Comments are due by December 11th. And I urge you all to read the full standard if you haven't already, and really get into it and try it on for size. So thanks, everybody. Should I stop sharing my screen? Yes, I will. How's that?
Great.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you. Ed, if you want to go ahead and come off mute, and you can go ahead and provide your background on it.
There we go. All right, Christian, thank you. And one of the reasons for bringing this standard to the URISA community is that within URISA, there are many, many address data managers who serve multiple different stakeholders and systems out of a single address repository. And that's a different set of challenges from people working with addresses inside the 911 operation sphere. And so the perspectives that we would get from the URISA community would be very important. And I'm hoping that people will be able to reflect on this session and the comments that occur and submit comments to the NENA work group that will evaluate them. And so I wanted to outline some questions to consider as you review the standard and to keep in mind. And the first one I would raise is, in your experience working with landmark and subaddress identifiers, in working with that construct, have you found it as confusing and subjective as Christian found it to be, or as Christian and the people, the NENA users in the work group found it to be? There are some fundamental reasons for making the distinction. The first is to be able to separate a landmark name and relate it to street addresses in a relational sense. And that relationship between landmark name and street address is very, very different from the relationship between a subaddress and a street address. There's a fundamental reason in terms of data structure to make that distinction. And secondly, you'll find it implicit in the postal standard, which was one of the foundational documents we looked at. There are a couple of other considerations that I noted in the background document that I sent around. That's the first question. Is the landmark subaddress distinction, as in your experience, as confusing and subjective as Christian found it to be? And conversely, is the named location hierarchy as defined in the draft standard more precise and consistent than the simple distinction between landmark and subaddress? A second set of questions to consider has to do with implementation. The named location hierarchy is essentially a set of categories. And it's a set of categories for the physical characteristics, or the landscape characteristics, if you will, of the feature that is named, whether it's a name or, apartment 101 or some, Empire State Building or something like that. What is that? Is it something that involves exterior features outside of a structure? Is it a structure per se? Or is it something interior to a structure? And all those categories are intended to subdivide those possibilities into a useful set of classifications. Do they do so? But whether they do or not, all of this is external to the address itself. An address specifies a location. It doesn't say anything about what's at the location. It just says where it is. So if you obtain, or in your system, compile a complete list of your landmark names, your subaddresses, your named location elements, all the identifiers, you're still not done for NENA, for CLDXF purposes. You also have to classify them. And classification requires knowledge of what's there. So does your organization, would you be able to do that classification without field investigation? Would you have the resources to do the field investigation if necessary, and to maintain that over time? And this burden really falls not on the NENA community, not on the 911 community per se, it falls on the address data manager. And so it really should be brought to the people that manage the creation and the retirement of addresses. This becomes an additional task they must do in order to serve the 911 community. And it must be done before any of this information can be placed into a CLDXF record, because there is no classification for uncertain, unknown, to be determined. You must do the classification first, or it can't go in the record. And this was by choice, to encourage people to do the work rather than just put it off and put it off. Well, is that a wise approach? So that's something else to consider. Third, these categories are new and they're untested. In my estimation, they're very likely to be changed over as they're tried in practice. There's lots of potential, I think, and I'd ask you to look at the definitions of the categories. Do you see any potential for overlap or ambiguity between them? Is it clear to you what is a wing, what is a unit, what is a room, what is a floor? Is it clear to you when something is a site or a subsite? I can think of some cases fairly common and some fairly unique where I'm not really sure what to, how to classify something, or maybe it's something that needs to be added. Classification is missing, for example. I'm thinking of stairways, emergency stairwell, north side emergency stairwell, which might go up 10 floors. How would that be fit into this set of elements? Or elevator shafts, like elevator, daily garage, elevator, north tower, elevator bank 1. Escalators in a subway station. The vertical penetration elements, I think, will have to be incorporated at some point in the future. So I tell someone to meet me at San Francisco Airport, Terminal B, door number 8, which is what I tell my sister when she comes to pick me up. What is door number 8 in this hierarchy? If we go to the Pentagon to find a unique case, Pentagon 2B315 means floor 2, ring B, because there are 5 rings in the Pentagon, of course, or 4, 5 rings in the Pentagon. Corridor 3, office 15. What is a ring? What is a corridor in the set of these categories? And is the 911 responder given any clearer information by having it classified into this set of categories rather than just using the terms as they're given? If the categories are changed, because the categories are used to define the elements themselves, if the categories are changed, then data will have to be redefined and moved around within the database, which is, forward migration is always difficult. Would this be better implemented as attributes of the identifiers rather than to classify the identifiers themselves? And lastly, because address data is used by so many different communities and across so many different systems, it really, I think, is incumbent on standards developers to provide for consistency or at least consistent translation among the different standards, so that we can move back and forth as the address data manager has to serve up information from the same repository to multiple different audiences. We should provide for consistent translation from one standard to another. By mixing the two categories, we then came to the question of, okay, how do you move data out of a CLDXF conformant set of classifications back to FGDC if someone is trying to serve communities who use both? The default instruction is, if it's in the subsite, with a few exceptions, if it's a subsite or a structure, send it with instructions to move it into the subaddress element, even though it might be a mix of both. Would you have any problems? The question I'd pose to the people here is, would you have any problems implementing those instructions or that process in your database? So with that, that's a very brief summary of a lot of discussion. And I'll just stop here and invite Rachel to open it up for discussion.
Yeah, so at this time, you guys are more than welcome to take yourselves on mute and start asking some questions. It's okay if they're, very basic. One thing, I guess, as a data manager that I want to go ahead and ask, well, I guess I'm more of a regional aggregator, I guess you could call myself. Working with various jurisdictions, like how in building plans would they get this type of information? I feel like it would need to go to the public safety sector instead of the actual data enterers to have it when they're doing those certifications for occupancy and those types of things. How would that actually function? Have you guys considered?
Not clear what that question is, sorry.
Like how are you guys envisioning this information be entered into the regional systems? Like in a practical sense?
Well, I mean, start with the fact that the vast majority of addresses, huge, overwhelming majority, are in the format of a street address and a unit identifier. They're already being, those location records already exist in that format in many municipal databases. They're managed that way with a separate column, a field for the unit identifier. So integrating that into a regional database is not going to be difficult. I think it's true that there is more of a burden here in terms of classification for the very small number of records that relate to the things I was calling sites and subsites and so on. And the trade-off is that by parsing it, by providing this more rigid structure, as we did in CLDXF v1 and as we extended it in v2, you're getting a way to organize and data and to do QA and to link data to GIS. So all the buildings on the MIT campus fit within a polygon that matches the site. So that type of organization gives you a lot of power. So that's the trade-off with the extra burden, so to speak, of classification. And one last point I want to make, which is just that there is a very simple way in which street addresses are associated with what we're now calling named locations, and that is that they exist in the same location record. So you have a street address, you fill out the street address components. You know, again, the burden of parsing there, well worth it to have the different components of the street name and so on. And then in the same record, you're listing a building identifier or a floor, a unit, wing, whatever. So the relationship is kind of built into the record. So that was something else that I don't know if it was really clear from what we were saying, but a CLDXF record includes all of the things that I've been talking about and the street address and the whole place name hierarchy and everything else. Does that answer your question at all? I don't know.
I think it doesn't, and I'll say why. Rachel, if I heard the question correctly, you're saying who would do this? And the answer really is, I think, has to be, it's up to each agency or organization to decide who has that responsibility, who is best positioned to be able to make the judgments that this is a room or it's a wing or it's a floor, and impose that responsibility. And it leaves wide open the question of what happened if they can't, if they don't know, if they can't go back and do the retrospective classification for all of the records that are already in place. It's a serious question and may substantially handicap implementation of V2 if it is actually adopted.
But they already have to do it for V1. They already have to do it. A 911 program has to classify the components of a location record in the way that V1 lays out.
Only for subaddress, not mixed with landmark names. And it's a much simpler system of categories with many holes in it, as we found out when we looked at it. But somebody has to do the work. And that's a serious question within an organization. Who's going to do it?
Yeah, because I just went through the process of interviewing my 80 or almost all of my 88 city jurisdictions. And, you know, they're even having a hard time just entering the base address, let alone digging into, you know, the various compartments of it. And we have, you know, the various case of movie studios and theme parks and all those other interesting challenges, but I don't want to take up too much time. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to pipe in here.
I have a question. This is Melissa Liebert. So is there any, I'll say, consequences to quote unquote improperly parsing out your address into these new fields? If I know the definitions have been defined within the document, but if there's still some wiggle room in that interpretation, one jurisdiction parses their data out in one way and another parses out slightly different. Are there any negative consequences that may come out of those actions?
Well, two things. One is there's a negative consequence of not doing it because you really can't match totally unstructured data to other unstructured data. So if you're doing any kind of conflation exercise, I think the structure is helpful. But the real point there, the consequence within, as you well know, within a 911 system, we're talking about validation. And validation can be customized. Validation can be handled by the 911 authority in a way that is either, demanding enough or flexible enough to meet their requirements. So I give you an example. If you have the campus of an elderly housing development community, and if the local 911 authority and say the whole campus, all the buildings have one street address, okay? If the local housing authority decides that they want to have, the local 911 authority decides they want to have each building named so that the responders, the dispatchers, everybody involved can see which building is which, then that's a requirement that they put in for validation at that level. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's no negative consequence in the sense of there's, a misclassification just means that a record may not validate. Somebody will either decide they have to look at it or decide that it's not an important discrepancy and they won't address it. So it's really, it's a structure, but the extent to which you're enforcing the structure, I don't think is, it's not as draconian as you might think. Does that answer your question, Melissa?
Yeah, it definitely does. Because, as Rachel said, I really appreciate, I know I was a participant for a small amount of time on the V2 document, but the additional fields that have been added, because I know I think it was the additional information or that field was kind of the kitchen sink. I'll say, if it didn't fit in the other elements, everyone kind of.
That's still in there. I should have listed it. And Ed,
is it?
Why didn't you point that out?
Oh, man.
Additional location information, the kitchen sink field is still in there.
Is it still in there? So, or, as a concern, now that you brought that up, that field's still in there, do you think any jurisdiction is just going to throw up their hands and go, nope, I'm still going to utilize that field to throw in all my data?
They might. If within your jurisdiction, you can find the location, it really doesn't matter internally what you do. You are the address authority. No one can say you have to do it differently right off the bat. But the consequences downstream might be felt. For example, Rachel will be getting data from you and 87 other agencies. And if everybody does it slightly differently, then Rachel goes to aggregate it. And what she finds in each different field will not be entirely consistent. So that's something that the whole purpose of setting up these categories was to try to avoid that. And that's just, there's inevitably some kind of judgment involved when you're trying to classify something as ill-defined and at the moment unstructured as subaddress and place or landmark name information.
Also point out, but I want to shut up too.
Yeah.
But also point out that, we spent 2 years beating on these definitions. And then, and people with a lot of experience in terms of location description. So the structure really does reflect a lot of experience and kind of, as I said, first responders, what do they need to know? How do they find something as quickly as possible?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that goes to the point about one of the comments about how it would potentially be used in a CAD system. Whether it present challenges, I think is the summation of that comment with this new structure.
Other questions?
Yeah, I mean, CAD systems, CAD systems, in a lot of ways, they're a disaster because they're proprietary. I'm just going to speak from my own experience, and I hope nobody takes offense. But in a lot of jurisdictions, they're proprietary. Sometimes jurisdictions will discover that they don't even own the data that they're managing in a CAD system. CAD systems very often don't have the kind of structure that we're talking about here, but that's not a good thing necessarily. I mean, you can have all the wildcards you want, but in terms of matching a record, finding a record, when you have a verbal report from a call, if the data aren't structured, that process, which is seconds count, it's going to be a lot dicier. And so CAD systems, they are flexible, and that's intentional. And in a lot of cases, that it's a disadvantage.
Other questions?
Yeah, this is Tom Fisher. A quick question, and pardon my ignorance. I'm actually GIS administrator for Cuyahoga County. We have 59 separate addressing jurisdictions within our county. Not to mention that the county actually has a township which we manage. But the question I have is that has, from Ed's point of view, there's a level of complexity that that increases the maintenance of this data standard. Has there been any jurisdiction that has piloted or tested the, implemented this and then look to see how it stands up to that maintenance challenge over a period of time? I mean, it sounds to me like it's more conceptual. It's everybody got around the table and here's a new standard. But I think of it from a practical application the same way Ed, I think, is presenting it. Has it ever been tested? Has it been field tested?
Not as is.
Yes, it has. So something very similar to this schema was used in building our statewide GIS and our next gen system. And, all the same levels, exact same kind of combination of what were called landmark and subaddress elements previously. It is exactly because of the practical issues that we encountered, 5 years ago in starting to design a next gen system and working with a vendor and trying to define things, that this schema evolved, and it exists. There are millions and millions of records. But as I said, the other thing to keep in mind, you just can't forget that 99.9% of records that even have a subaddress element, that's going to be a unit. And the other ones, it's going to be a named building in a room. And that's going to be a very, very tiny minority. And the last point, going back to who is going to do this work is required for facility managers. It's required. If you have a multi-line telephone system, you have to describe the location of the phone to be compliant with 911 standards. So it's not a question of if you want to or not. You have to do this level of classification for 911, for a next gen system, for CLDXF V1. And if you are a facility manager and you're responsible for a VoIP system over, many different campuses, you're a big organization, or even if you have just one campus with many buildings, you have to provide this level of detail for 911. It's just required.
And so if a university, and this happens a lot, a benefactor provides, a couple $100 million and wants a wing named after them, you're saying that the facility manager knows that, the phone system's already established and it's already been put in place under the old name. They know to actually, report this to whoever's maintaining that data in the 911 system, that it's now has a new name, a new honorary, wing associated at the university, or anything like that. Name changes happen all the time. Obviously, roadways are the same thing. Like Martin Luther King Way, how many of those, were set up that way? Most of them were renamed, right? But so has that been fleshed out and tested? It seems like, I think that seems to be more where Ed's coming from, is maybe established address under this new system, but then how is it maintained moving forward? Whose responsibility is it? Communication is it's really hard, especially in government. We don't do it the best. And so I think that would be a challenge. Yeah.
Your example, okay, if a building has a name, I kind of, in our own experience, the building was the important level of detail. And then in terms of validation, in terms of assigning, linking that CLDXF record, going in the GIS data model, that record has to be linked to a site structure address point, okay? So if the building has a name and the name changes, yeah, you got to maintain that. That's part of, you have a system, you have to maintain it. You can't just collect the data and forget it. But if a wing gets named, well, it would be good to put it in, but if the building name hasn't changed, then probably you're going to be able to find it. So my answer to all these questions is no data set is perfect. We're just trying to ensure that there's enough structure so that you can validate what's in there and link it to a GIS and organize it and do quality assurance. And all of this is designed to support those goals. And whether or not you have every last detail necessarily the same, it may not matter. It may not be that important. It's back to what Melissa was asking, kind of the same question, which is, yeah, if you have a named building and the name changes, you got a deal. That if a caller is going to say, I'm in the Wilkinson building, you got to be able to find that in your database. And maybe they don't know the street address. That name, the building name, is really, really important. And it's got to be in there.
Christian,
Does that answer your question at all?
With due respect, I have to differ on one point, Christian. That is, it may have been prototyped in MassGIS, something like this. Other than that, I don't know that anybody else has tried it. And this set of categories was not based on any other standard. It was not developed by people with anyone who included anyone with any professional knowledge of architecture or structural engineering. It was just done by people who are doing the best they can as volunteers.
Well, we looked at AM/FM. You remember the discussion.
We didn't get much from them either. They're not really doing what we need to do. So this is going to be worked out over time, and it's going to evolve. It really hasn't been tested by experience over a range of sites across the country.
Yes, that is true in terms of official adoption. Obviously, a standard that is coming out for the first time hasn't been officially adopted. But I will tell you this, from spending a lot of time talking to people who are building these systems, that is system integrators, phone company technicians, cable company, et cetera, a lot of times the way that they organize their data reflects this natural what I think is a natural and intuitive way of organizing sites, buildings, and so on. And we didn't invent this. This is the way a lot of technicians enter in a record. This is the way, you know, a lot of facility managers, Harvard University, right? They're using something very similar to this. And a lot of organizations that are now involved in maintaining location records, the concept of a site, it's in there. They have a name for it. It's a school name, or it's an airport name, or whatever. So it's not like this is something radical. The concept of a site is a very intuitive and widely used concept.
Just to clear a few things up, we have a few questions in the chat. So are the floor and room fields an expectation or a requirement for the verification process of a call?
I don't want to get too much into 911 validation and requirements, because my understanding and you know, is that the 911 authority is going to determine this. So if they and a lot of responders will tell you that the floor is the most important thing. They don't necessarily care about having a unit identifier or a room identifier as much as they care about having a floor identifier. Obviously, they do care about unit identifier and room identifier. You know, they got to get there, but the floor is really important. So a lot of jurisdictions might say, if you have a multi-unit building, then we want you to specify the floor. But again, it's a structure. It's the local jurisdiction that's going to determine, I think, how it, you know, how it gets enforced.
This Melissa, I want to kind of jump in, but isn't CLDX going to be used in LVF? So all these new elements will now be part of that LVF?
Yes, it will be there. But what I'm saying is that the way validation works and what's required and the level of what is a critical discrepancy versus what is a sort of an optional discrepancy, that is really part of, in my experience, which is limited, admittedly, but in my experience, that's part of the system design. That's part of somebody saying, we need to know the floor in these situations. If we have a unit, we need to know the floor or not. And that's where, you know, I think that you're providing a structure, but it's not as rigid as people may be afraid of.
Other questions?
Do you think it's going to be rigid for, because if NGCS provider is creating and utilizing an I3 LVF and they look at the CLDXF standard, do you think they're going to, and I know this is probably subjective, but take that, you know, it's a standard that NENA's put out, so it is rigid.
The structure is fixed. The structure is rigid. And it's intended to accommodate every kind of location that we could think of. And then there is that catch-all, you know, additional location. But I think where we're sort of going around is it rigid in the sense of requiring every, you know, all the detail? So think back to the old emergency phone system data that supported the very beginning of 911, right? Technicians would come into a home and they'd have this free-form loc data field or whatever they called it, and they'd say, this phone is in the living room, all right? And they would probably put LVRM all as one word, or I've seen every abbreviation that you could think of. And fine, that's human readable, it's useful. You know, it isn't required, but it's something that they recorded when they put the phone in. And that's, you know, you could take that, and I've looked at millions and millions of those records, literally, and a lot of them with AI sort of techniques, and you can sort of translate LVRM into living room and say, oh, it says room, that's a room identifier, and do what you will with it. But my point is, that's a function, that's an evolution of the quality of the data which this structure supports. But it doesn't mean that every single phone line has to have the room specified where it is. Do you see what I'm saying?
So I think Tom made an interesting point about the 3D BIM mapping, that it lends itself to 3D XYZ type data schemas, as opposed to the 2D just XY. Was that taken into account? Should that?
Yes. And NENA is very, I don't know if Ed has something to say, I'm sorry, but NENA is very focused right now on 3D. And there have been various industry initiatives that talk about 3D, and there's obviously, you know, more and more capability technically to have a Z component in a mobile call. And the point there is that this could be the kind of extension that Ed was talking about. We spent some time trying to standardize the information that would be entered into the floor field. So that's a beginning. What we said is that all floor identifiers that could be translated into an integer, that should be done. So ordinal number, number word, ordinal word, all those forms of a floor identifier, you would put in the integer. And, you know, without too much imagination, you can take that and multiply it by 9 or 10, whatever, feet per floor. And then you come up with a Z. But we don't have a Z in the sense of, you know, establishing a reference point, you know, Z above what? It's a pretty huge topic and pretty challenging. But I think it would be an evolution of this standard to specify more exactly an elevation. Does that get at the question you're asking?
Yeah, I think so. And since we only have about 2 minutes left until this line has to be used for another call, do you guys have any closing comments, or do you guys want to continue maybe this discussion? Because it's been really interesting feedback on another line.
I'm ready to continue if people are interested.
Rachel, this is Melissa. I'd also like to plug, because NENA is looking for comments on this V2 so that the working group can address any public concerns. And I know that there is a Connect subject, URSA Connect. So if people also have questions or comments on the V2, I highly encourage them to put them there, because URSA is trying to get a kind of a consolidated response. So URSA Connect is a great location also to put comments and questions.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and also put that link in the chat underneath the Zoom link. So I created a meeting on my personal Zoom account. So if you guys want to take maybe, you know, a 3 to 5 minute break, and we could jump over there, so we could go ahead and give URISA back this Zoom line.
Are we going to lose your connection as soon as we lose access to the chat?
Yeah, probably.
So in the chat box is this link that you just put up?
The Zoom link, Zoom meeting. Yep.
Copy paste quick.
Yeah, you should be able to save that too, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully. All right. If you can't find it, go ahead and yell at me or something. I don't know. Find me on LinkedIn. I'll go ahead and post it there also if you guys need.
Please submit comments to NENA on your own behalf based on your experience. It'd be very valuable input to the committee.
Amen.
Positive, negative, or sideways.
Amen.
And thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you guys.
And we'll continue around the corner.
Yeah, make sure you copy that link from the chat and head over to the other meeting for further discussion. And thank you to the presenters and Rachel for moderating.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'll go ahead and start that meeting now.